The three talks in this session have been chosen deliberately to relate to each other. The common link is they are all about long-run measures of income or income dynamics or income volatility, and they show off the data on the data sources we have on income in the UK from household panel surveys. The first paper from Silvia is looking at the income data in the British Household Panel Survey, which ran from 1991 to 2008. And the second two papers, presented first by Tom Waters and then myself, look at the income data in Understanding Society as well, which runs from 2009 to the present day. And we launched our paper on the income data on Understanding Society on Twitter on Friday, and with the main appeal being a very large 70-page annex and everything you possibly need to know about income in Understanding Society, how it relates to other sources like the Family Resources Survey, what to do about imputation and attrition, and so on. So I think we'll get going. The rules will be 25 minutes for the speakers and then 5 minutes of questions after each paper. Silvia.
Thank you, Mike. I think you should have said that the other common thing is that you are a co-author of all three papers. So here's the first one, where we focus on the role of taxes and benefits in smoothing income shocks using BHPS panel data. So I'm going to start by saying a few things about what motivated us to do this piece of work and what we think our contribution to the literature is. Then talk a bit about insurance and the role of taxes and benefits, and then move on to data, methods, results, and finally some summing up and conclusions. Okay, so historically, many transfer programs have been constructed explicitly as a sort of insurance. So if you think of, Bismarckian programs started in Germany in the 19th century, but also, in the US later on, these programs were aimed to provide income to workers in case of catastrophic earnings loss. Now, there is a very large literature in economics that has focused on the adverse behavioral effects of these programs, especially on labor supply, but also on other things such as fertility, household formation, health behaviors, and so on. We would argue that there is less evidence on the positive side of these programs, and especially on whether they achieved their intended objective, their original objective of providing insurance. So we would argue this point is really important because we know that many risks that individuals face in the labor market are uninsurable because of moral hazard, adverse selection, and so on. And so there is an important role for public interventions. So what we do in this paper, we quantify the extent to which UK taxes and benefits mitigate income shocks between 1991 and 2008. And we do this by constructing an income dynamics model that aims to separate the variability of income into three different components. The first component is an individual fixed effect that we term heterogeneity. The second one is random long-lasting shocks, which we term permanent shocks, although you will see in the specification they're not truly permanent, and finally short-lived shocks, which we will refer to as transitory shocks. We examine how much the tax benefit system as a whole, but also components of it. We will focus on 4 different components, reduce the variance coming from the 3 sources. Okay, so there is, in the social policy literature, maybe perhaps less in economics, but in the social policy literature, there is a stark distinction drawn between social security programs and social assistance. So in the first social security, the programs are supposed to be mimicking insurance, right? They are, individuals pay contributions, they receive a sort of coverage against unexpected shocks such as ill health, unemployment, accidents, and so on. This often is contrasted with means-tested social assistance, which is supposed to be about redistribution. We would argue, though, that this is a distinction without a difference, because if you think about it, many income shocks are not covered by a specific program. A lot of the income variability that individuals face, for example, due to variable working hours or downward occupational mobility, is not covered by a specific program. In contrast, income-tested transfers do provide a sort of consumption insurance during periods of low income. Finally, there is the role of progressive taxation, which has been recognized really early on in the US, that provides an automatic stabilization mechanism for incomes. Now, what do we know about insurance and taxes and benefits? Well, we do know that if we measure redistribution across the life cycle rather than at a given point in time, estimates are much lower, and typically half. So this suggests that a lot of the cross-sectional redistribution is across states rather than across individuals. Then there are a number of US studies that have focused on particular programs and their role in ensuring consumption against shocks, and they do typically find important, significant effects. Finally, whole system studies also have found an important role for taxes and benefits in reducing the variability of income. One finding that is perhaps surprising, but is quite common across these studies, is that taxes usually play as an important role, and sometimes actually a more important role than benefits in mitigating income variability. Now, we would argue that with a few exceptions, the literature focuses on the US. And of course, the tricky part is how to measure insurance, right? And in particular, how to separate insurance from so-called pure redistribution. Finally, it's not clear how the various elements of the tax benefit system compare in providing this insurance. So we will address the second point by borrowing from the earnings dynamics literature, and the third point by using detailed income information to build several income concepts. But before I go on, I should say that there is a paper by Richard Blundell and his co-authors that is very similar to ours. It uses Norwegian administrative data rather than British survey data, as we do, which you might obviously will think, well, it's much better, and it is. However, they focus really on characterizing the labor income process. Given the rich data that they have, they can do that. But they also look as a second issue to the extent to which the entire Norwegian tax benefit system reduces income variability. And actually, their specification is very close to ours, which I should say is actually a coincidence. Okay, so the data we used, the BHPS 18 ways from 1991 to 2008. This contains really detailed information about all income sources, including receipt of approximately 35 different types of benefits. And we combine this information with information about income taxes and national insurance from the Household Net Income series produced by Stephen Jenkins and his co-authors. And we use this data to construct 5 income concepts. So we start with household gross equivalized market incomes, including that includes labor and non-labor sources of income. And then we add to this contributory benefits. Then we add non-contributory, non-means tested benefits. These are mostly contingent benefits related to disability, but they also include things such as, for example, the child benefit, which was universal during the period we study. Finally, we add means-tested benefits, and we subtract taxes and national insurance. And we have our 5 income concepts that we will use in the analysis. We drop observations where we drop individuals that lack at least 4 consecutive observations due to identification reasons. And then we select in the first wave, in each household, we select a person randomly, a person aged between 22 and 55. And we do this separately for men and women. So the reason we do this is because the identification in our models depends on there being no cross-sectional correlations in incomes. So we are left with a sample of almost 2,000 men and slightly over 2,200 women. We then go on and model income growth over the lifetime by constructing an income growth model. And following the earnings dynamics literature, we do that in the 2 stages. So in the first stage, we regress incomes on a polynomial in age, time fixed effects, region fixed effects, and their interaction. And in the second stage, we take the residual from this regression and we model it as a sum of 3 components. The first one, alpha, is the fixed effect, so that is the heterogeneity effect. The second one, mu, is the permanent shock, which is modeled as an autoregressive process of order 1. And finally, the third one is the transitory shock, which is modeled as a moving average of order 1. We allow the variances of these 3 components to vary over time by having year-specific time loadings. And then we estimate the variances of the 3 components, so of alpha, of the innovation in the permanent shock components eta, and epsilon, the innovation in the moving average process, together with the persistence parameters rho and theta, and the time loadings. I should say we, unlike the earnings literature, we include all income, so we include 0 incomes. Because we focus on household level incomes, the zeros are not such a big problem for us, but instead of logging income, what we do, we use the inverse hyperbolic sign, which is which allows the inclusion of zeros and even of negative income values. We apply this decomposition across our 5 income concepts, and then we compare the magnitude of the 3 variances across these 5 income concepts to see what adding various taxes and benefits to incomes, what does that do to the variance. We do the analysis separately for men and women, and then we also do it separately for low-skilled men and low-skilled women, the reason being that the UK system is really targeted. So it's really focused towards low-income families, so we would expect perhaps stronger effects for those who are low-skilled. Low-skilled here is defined as having lower secondary education or less in the first wave. So here are results. You see here our main results for men. Both men overall on the right-hand side and low-skilled men on the left-hand side. So looking at, for example, at permanent shocks, you see that the variability of income after taxes and benefits is much lower. And actually, it is reduced by around 40 to 60%, depending on year. both for men and for low-skilled men. Then if we look at transitory shocks, here the effect seems to be much smaller and only present when we look at the overall, the general sample. Even in this case, there seems to be a fall in that the difference between the two lines is getting smaller, especially after the 2000s. Finally, if you look at heterogeneity, again, unsurprisingly large effects. About half of the variance in income due to heterogeneity is reduced by taxes and benefits. The effects are even larger for low-skilled men, but notice that there is a big decline, especially for low-skilled men. So there is a decline in the share of the variance that is reduced by taxes and benefits from around 70% to around 35–40%. Now, if we look in more detail, for example, at the variance of permanent shocks, we see that the reduction is mostly done by taxes and means-tested benefits, and taxes are more important for the average man, and means-tested benefits are more important for the low-skilled man. Finally, if we look at transitory shocks, here it seems that the small reduction in the variance that I've shown you in the previous graph is actually all due to taxes, and that actually contributory benefits or actually all the other types of benefits seem to have very little or no effect. Okay, so when we do the same analysis for women, we get a picture that is similar. Again, we find very strong effects of the tax benefit system on permanent shocks and on heterogeneity. So in the case of permanent shocks, we find even larger, slightly larger effects, so about half, both for women overall and for low-skilled women. But there seems to be a bit of, in relative terms, there is a bit of a decline in the share of the variance that is reduced by taxes and benefits. If we look at transitory shocks, again, no effect in the case of low-skilled women. But we do find some effects, especially before 2000, for women overall. Finally, big effects for heterogeneity actually is, in relative terms, bigger than for men. In the case of low-skilled women, especially in the beginning of the period, about 70 to 80% of the variance is absorbed by taxes and benefits. However, note that the decline in the capacity of taxes and benefits to reduce this type of income variability is declining, and is especially declining for low-skilled women, mostly because it seems the variance of market incomes is falling, but that of net income is not, or not to the same extent. Okay, so then if we do the same exercise and we look at various instruments, first permanent shocks, again we see that the most important instruments are taxes and means-tested benefits. For women overall, and for low-skilled women, it's means-tested benefits and non-means-tested benefits that are most important in reducing the variance. Finally, looking at transitory shocks, just as in the case of men, we find that the small effect of the overall tax benefit system is actually attributable to taxes. And there is no effect that we find for low-skilled women of any of the tax benefit components. So to sum up, we find that taxes and benefits reduce approximately half of the income variability due to permanent shocks and due to heterogeneity. We find much smaller effects, but also there is much more noise in estimating the effects on transitory shocks. We find the most important instruments are means-tested benefits and taxes. But their effect, especially when we look at heterogeneity, seems to be declining sharply, especially among the low-skilled. Finally, we find that if we look at permanent shocks, the low-skilled face similar insurance levels as the average individual, but they're more reliant on means-tested benefits compared to the average individual, which benefits more from taxes. The effects are relatively similar for men and women. It's slightly higher for women, and they also benefit more from means-tested benefits. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for questions, and unlike in normal sessions, I can't go first and ask a question myself because, as Silvia said, I'm a co-author on the paper, so I won't be asking any. Anyone in the audience want to ask anything? Tom, you can ask a question.
So when you split it, thank you. Yeah, when you look at the contribution of different benefits and taxes, is that sensitive at all to the ordering? So I'm wondering, because you gave a particular order, and whether, you know, if you took taxes off first, you might get a rather different picture, because the ordering is sort of essentially arbitrary, right?
It is arbitrary to some extent. I mean, we had taxes at the end just to make sure that, you know, all the taxable incomes are there, you know, included, and we're not including taxes without including the tax base. We have done slightly, I mean, we haven't done an enormous amount of sensitivity testing on this because it's quite, getting these models to converge on this many income concepts is quite tricky. We have done some things where we ordered it slightly differently and there were no big differences, but yeah, admittedly we should try and do more. Yeah.
Thank you. Last call for any other comments or questions? No? Okay, then we'll thank Silvia.
Thanks.
And our second talk is by Tom Waters on the distributional impact of universal credit.
Great, thanks very much. Yes, so as Mike said, we're going to be looking at distributional consequences of universal credit, UC, as a particularly topical policy, and as with the other papers in this session, going to be thinking about things over a longer run. Okay, so the background that we see here as being relevant is that when people do distributional analysis of policy, the kind of standard way of doing it is you look at people's circumstances at a particular point in time, which I'm going to be calling the short run. So it's essentially when the person was surveyed or when the household was surveyed. But that said, it's perhaps becoming somewhat more common to look at things over a slightly longer run. And when you do that, you find that typically the longer run distributional consequences of policy are kind of a dilution of the short run effect. So if the short run effect was progressive, the longer run effect is also progressive, but less so, and similarly for regressive policies. And the reason for that is essentially just because of income dynamics. So just to illustrate the point here, this is the UK income distribution. You can see at the top, this is for year one. And we've got a particular person here who is out of work. And so they're right at the bottom of the income distribution. And so they get unemployment benefit. And so when you look at things at a particular point in time, unemployment benefit looks really progressive because almost everyone that gets it is right at the bottom of the income distribution. But if we follow this person over time, maybe they move into work, and for the next 5 years or 10 years or for the rest of their life, they're in work and they are getting kind of a middle income. So they're not getting unemployment benefit now, But when we look at their incomes over a 5-year period or a 10-year period, they're going to be somewhere further up the income distribution. But part of that 5-year or 10-year income will include unemployment benefit. And so that causes this kind of dilution effect as people move around. Policies that look really progressive in the short run look less so in the longer run, and similarly for regressive policies. But it's also possible for policies to generate more subtle effects, kind of similar to tagging from the optimal income tax literature. And so the way to kind of think about this is if you take two households who today have the same income, same short-run income, it might be that benefit receipt could be conditioned on various characteristics, and those characteristics might be predictive of their longer-run income. And so that particular characteristic they have is kind of being tagged so that you get more or less redistribution towards those with a particular characteristic. And that can cause the short and the longer-run distributional pictures to diverge. And why is this sort of thing interesting? Well, this allows us to think about how policymakers can target the longer-run poor, or for that matter, the longer-run rich. So typically, policymakers are constrained to base benefit entitlements or tax liabilities on current circumstances. But if you can find something that is predictive in those current circumstances of longer-term measures of income, then you can target the longer-run poor or the longer-run rich. I should say in all this, I'm going to talk a lot about the longer run. Isn't to say that measures of short-run income aren't important because of things like credit constraints. Even if over the longer run you're relatively well off, it can still be unpleasant to be poor at a particular point in time. But it's also clearly policymakers have a legitimate interest in people who are persistently poor. Okay, so what are we going to be doing today? So we're going to be illustrating these points, looking at universal credit, or UC, and providing the first longer-run distributional analysis of that policy. We're going to show how the distributional consequences that you see are driven by specific features of the policy. And then we're going to develop a method for decomposing these longer-run effects into the two mechanisms I've described, this kind of standard dilution that you get from income dynamics, plus this sort of tagging or thing like tagging that I've described. I'm very particularly keen if you have any feedback on this method. So to do this, we're going to use Understanding Society, which is UK household longitudinal survey, and we're going to have 8 waves. I'm just going to keep everyone who's in for all 8 waves. And we're going to use a micro-simulation model so we can simulate their entitlements under universal credit and under the system that preceded it. In this, we're going to be assuming no labor supply responses or any other kind of behavioral effects, kind of standard micro-simulation. And we're going to be measuring we're going to have 2 income measures. So short-run net income, so that's your incomes at the point in time, at the point you were surveyed, and longer-run incomes, which is your average over 8 years. And so that basically measures the currently rich and poor versus the persistently rich and poor. What we're not going to be able to pick up is intra-year volatility. And so really there, actually, when I say 8-year average incomes, I mean the average of the 8 times that we see you in the data, which is approximately a year apart in each case. So if there's any intra-year volatility, we can't pick that up. Okay, so a bit of a primer on universal credit. It's the biggest reform to the working age benefit system in several decades. When it's fully rolled out, about 1/3 of working age households will receive it at any one time. It'll be even more over a number of years. Overall, it represents a small cut to entitlements, but there's lots of winners and losers. And ultimately, what it's doing is it's integrating together 6 means-tested benefits from the old system, so the legacy system. And you can see how that works in this chart here. So this is just for an example household, lone parent with 2 kids who's renting. And on the horizontal axis, got the number of hours they're working, and on the y-axis, their benefit entitlements. And so first, job seekers allowance, unemployment benefit, that they're entitled to that when they're out of work, and it tapers out pretty quickly once they get into work. Then they get housing benefit, which tapers somewhat more slowly, child tax credit, which tapers even more slowly, and then working tax credit, which is based on the number of hours that you work, so they get a boost at 16 and 30 hours. So this gives the total benefit entitlement has a sort of lots of kinks and notches. Compared to that, universal credit structure looks much more simple. And there's two things I want you to take away from this picture. The first is that because the universal credit system is much more simple, being based just on an amount that you can earn before your benefit starts to be withdrawn, and then a taper rate above that, there's no way for UC to kind of replicate the old system, the legacy system, and so that means inevitably you're going to get lots of winners and losers. And then the second thing to note is that for this particular example household, you can see at most of the hours points that they can work, they would be better off or equally as well off as they were under the legacy system. And that's essentially because they're a renter. So under the legacy system, as you earned more, you'd see your housing benefit withdrawn because you were a renter, so you got housing benefit, and you'd see your tax credits withdrawn. And so that gave a very high effective marginal tax rate. Under UC, you just have a single taper rate, which basically makes the system more generous to renters or to working renters. You can see how that's different if you look at an owner-occupier. So this person isn't renting, so they can't get housing benefit. And so when, under the legacy system, when they earned more, they just tapered out of tax credits and had a lower marginal tax rate. And so the fact that they get applied the UC tax rate in the new world, taper rate in the new world, means that they on average tend to lose out. So that's going to have some impacts on our results. I'll say something more about that later. Our overall results you can see here. This is the distributional effects of UC. Here, these are the short-run bars, so I'm ranking people by their current or short-run income, and then showing the effect of UC on their short-run income. You can see UC looks very regressive, with the poorest decile losing the most by some distance. If we turn to the longer run, so here I'm ranking people by longer run incomes, average income over 8 years, and showing the effect of UC on longer run incomes. It looks considerably less regressive, quite a bit smaller loss in the bottom decile and bigger losses in the third and fourth. So what's kind of behind this difference? So part of what's going on is that as well as the integration of benefits that I just described, UC also makes some additional changes. So firstly, those who have significant assets tend to lose in UC. Assets are treated more harshly, so if you have assets, your benefit entitlement is reduced more quickly. Secondly, the self-employed tend to lose. And thirdly, the people with disabilities on average lose as well, although the changes here are quite complex. There's actually almost as many winners as losers, but on average, disabled people lose. And then, as I've already mentioned, working owner-occupiers tend to lose, whereas working renters tend to gain. Okay, so why does all this matter? What's this got to do with the short and the longer-run distributional picture? Well, it turns out that this kind of forces a wedge in between the two and causes them to differ, because these people essentially have different income dynamics. People who are affected by these policies have different income dynamics to those that aren't. And so you can see that here. So what I'm going to do now is show you those who are currently poor, which I'm going to just define as being in the bottom quintile of the current, of the short-run income distribution. And we're going to look at those who are currently poor, what share find that status is temporary. So when we look at their longer run incomes, they're in the top 80%, top 4 quintiles. Now, overall, of those who are currently poor, about a quarter of them find that state is temporary. So their short run incomes puts them in the bottom fifth, but their longer run incomes put them in the top 4/5. But if you have substantial assets, the likelihood that your your poverty is temporary is considerably higher at 41%. And that's important because, as I mentioned a moment ago, those with substantial assets tend to find that they lose quite a lot out of UC. And so that policy is hitting those that are more likely to find their poverty is temporary. And we can kind of zoom in on this policy, this part of the policy, the asset tests, and look at their distributional consequences, and I'll do that here. So if you look at the effect of these tougher asset tests, we're looking at income deciles here, but I've just collapsed the top half into one bar. If you look at the effects of these tougher asset tests, in the short run, they're very regressive. Essentially, the only people that lose are the bottom 20%. Over the longer run, the picture's considerably less regressive, though still, notably, still is regressive. And so that's part of what's driving the difference between the short and the longer run for universal credit is these tougher asset tests, which hit the short run very poor, but over the longer run have somewhat more neutral effects. Now you might think, well, this could just be down to the same dilution point that I made earlier. It might just be that people that hit in the short run, they just move around naturally, and that kind of spreads the losses over the distribution when we look in the longer run. But we can actually see that isn't all that's going on, at least, with this picture here. So here I'm categorizing people on the x-axis by their short-run incomes, and then I'm showing on the y-axis their longer-run income divided by their short-run income. And so higher numbers basically mean they're going to be richer over the longer run than they are today. And as you can see, those particularly towards the bottom, those with substantial assets are likely to find their longer-run incomes quite a lot higher than their short-run incomes. And so when you bring in these tougher asset tests and you hit people who have high assets and are low income today, you're basically more likely to be hitting people who are over the longer run somewhat less poor. And so that's essentially just showing the same sort of statistic you see there, the 41%. I should flag, obviously, that 41% is still a relatively low number, and 60% of the people that get hit by the asset tests who are currently poor end up being persistently poor. But that's part of what's driving the wedge between the short and the longer end distributional picture. Now we do the same thing for the other groups that get hit by particular parts of UC. So the self-employed get hit, and they're also more likely to find that their current poverty is a temporary state. Same for those in owner-occupied housing. Again, another group that does very badly out of UC are more likely to find that they're in temporary poverty than those that are renters. But the one that goes the other way, perhaps not surprisingly, is disabled people or those that live with disabled people. They're more likely to find that their poverty is a persistent state. But as I said before, some of them gain out of UC, so this has slightly ambiguous consequences, but overall they do lose. Okay, so what does all this kind of mean? What can we kind of say about it? So we can see that these features of UC that cause large losses are more likely to hit those who are currently poor but are longer run, somewhat higher income. So that's this kind of tagging that I've been talking about. Well, can we quantify this tagging? So again, if we just look at those that are currently poor, currently in the bottom 20% of the income distribution, we find that for those for whom that's a temporary state, they lose 2.1% of their income as a result of UC in the period when they're poor, when they're in the bottom quintile. Whereas the persistently poor lose 0.7%. So what that means is you take two people, they're both in the bottom quintile today, but one of them is going to, over the longer run, be in the top 4/5, and the other one's going to remain over the longer run in the bottom 5th. UC means that on average, today, the one that is going to do better in the future will be hit harder today. And that's even though UC only bases entitlement on current circumstances. So that's kind of, again, another kind of example of this tagging. Those that are going to be longer run, higher income, lose more today when they get moved to UC. But But of course, on top of that, you've also just got the straightforward effect from income dynamics, this kind of dilution effect that I've been talking about. And so that kind of raises the question, well, can we decompose the longer run distributional picture into these two components? Just this sort of the almost mechanical consequence of income dynamics plus this tagging that I've been talking about. And so to do that, we have a method that we have tried. So what we're going to try to do is to derive a counterfactual income distribution where you bring in a reform. This could work for any reform. You bring in a reform, but it doesn't tag at all. It has the same short-run consequences, and at a given point in time, the same income deciles, say, lose the same amount, but there's no tagging. So in other words, your longer run distribution, your longer run income isn't predictive of how the policy hits you today, conditional on your short run income. That's what we're going to try to derive. How are we going to do that? So first, we're going to try to compute the impact of the reform by your position in the short-run income distribution. There's lots of ways to do that. I'll just do it using short-run deciles today. And so this is straightforward. This is what we've already done. So I'll kind of flick back and forth and show you a worked example. So here we just pool everyone together. We put people into income deciles based on their current income, and then we say, what's the effect of UC on your current income today? And so the bottom decile in this is just a hypothetical reform. The bottom decile lose 10%, and the second decile lose 2%, and the third decile aren't affected. Okay, so that's easy. Step 2, we're going to simulate incomes to get this counterfactual distribution. We're going to simulate incomes for every observation using what your pre-reform income is and the current position you are in the short-run distribution and the short-run impact from 1 that we've just calculated. So let me make that a bit more specific. So this is for an example individual, just a hypothetical individual. We see them for 3 years. In the pre-reform world, their income's £200, £800, £300, and that happens to put them in deciles 1, 3, and 2. And so what we're going to do is we're going to pick out a simulated impact from the table above. So in the first year, they're in the bottom decile, so they're going to have a 10% loss. Second year, they're in the third decile, so they don't have any change, and so on. And then multiply that by their pre-reform income, and that's going to give you their simulated income, and then from that we can just take the average to get their longer run income. Now what does this do? This basically gives us a distribution where conditional on your short run income, your longer run income doesn't predict the impact that the policy would have on you. So the only thing that matters for how you're affected today is where you are in the short-run income distribution. So there's no tagging in the way I've described. So if we use, and then we can use this as a kind of a no tagging kind of baseline to compare that to the actual effects of the policy to work out how much the policy is tagging. So if we use this for universal credit, I'm just going to switch to quintiles here to make things a bit easier to see. This is just the standard short-run effect, which I've already shown you. You see is very regressive, bottom quintile losing the most. Then just the consequence of that short-run effect and how people actually move around the income distribution gives you this longer-run picture from UC. So this is the counterfactual distribution that I showed you, showed how we calculate a moment ago. And so this also still looks pretty regressive, with the bottom decile losing quite a lot, the bottom quintile losing quite a bit more than the second quintile. So if there was no tagging, this is the kind of picture we would expect to see. What we in fact see is the picture drawn by the black line there. That's the actual effect of UC on longer run incomes. And so the difference between the two is tagging. And so what this basically means is that the fact that you see kind of implicitly conditions on your longer run income by giving you less if you've got assets or if you're an owner-occupier, things like that, that causes those who are in the longer run bottom quintile to do a bit better than they otherwise would, and those in the second quintile to do a bit worse. And so what the tagging is doing here is it actually turns the reform from, you can see here it looks really pretty regressive, and then here the bottom two quintiles lose almost the same. So basically the tagging is moving money from the kind of lower to middle income group to the poor group. Okay, so bringing everything together. So on a short-run basis, UC is regressive. It's a larger cut, substantially larger cut for lower-income individuals, and that's still true when we look at the longer run. But the effect is quite a lot less pronounced. And part of that is the natural dilution of income dynamics that you always have, but it's also partly because UC has these features, such as tougher asset tests, that essentially mean that the temporarily poor lose more than the persistently poor. And so that drives a wedge between the longer and the short run impacts. We develop a method to decompose these two effects, and we find for UC a modest tagging effect, which basically moves money from the second quintile to the bottom quintile. And this allows policymakers to target the longer run poor or rich. If they can find a characteristic which is predictive of longer run, your position in the longer run income distribution, they can base entitlements on that, and that allows this sort of tagging. And this method allows us to quantify just how important that tagging is. I think that's everything. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Tom, any questions or comments? Yes, one at the back.
Weekly rent and the housing benefit of £100 a week. Obviously, that's going to vary a lot. Have you looked into the effects of different rental regionally?
Yeah, so the £100 a week, that was just for that example household I showed you. So the main analysis is using people's actual rents. But yeah, I suppose an important part of the way, it's not actually specific to UC, but the way that UK benefit policy has gone is essentially makes it harder for those who are in higher rent areas to get a housing benefit that keeps up with their rent. So that actually might be an interesting to look at, whether those people have different kind of basically different income dynamics to those who are in actually just quite low rent areas. That's a good point.
Thank you. Any others? Yes.
Sorry, I know we're looking at this picture, so apologies if it's a stupid question.
Right.
But I was wondering, you see this difference between the short run and the long run, but do you think that there is any behavioral changes that can be expected because of these policies? I mean, the fact that, say, temporary poor loses out more than long-run poor. Do you think that there is anything else going on?
So, okay, yeah, so if there was behavioral effect from that. So we're just looking at, we're just simulating people's entitlements based on what actually happened to them in the past, before the policy, mostly before the policy came in. So yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so I suppose it's possible you might find those who lose out temporarily, I suppose, are in a lot of cases going to be people who drop out of work for a short period of time and then get back into work. And so I suppose we might want, yeah, you might think that that basically giving those people a harder time when they do drop out of work could have, I guess, some sort of labour supply effect, which is more likely to keep them in or get them back into work sooner or something. But I don't know, really, to be sure.
Thank you. Silvia, do you have a question?
Assets are also a result of your past incomes, and the fact that you do have assets suggests that your income was higher in the past, and so might also be higher in the future. One other option would be to maybe try and target based not on current income, but say on the past 3 years' income or something like that. Have you tried comparing and seeing whether taking more years is actually better prediction than trying to get these proxies too?
Okay, so you mean if the government actually based entitlements? Yeah. So yeah, no, that's a good point. So yeah, we could look at in a hypothetical world where the government actually does that, how well could they, how good a proxy, I guess, is the things they're actually using. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I guess it's important as well that, in the UK, we have a system which almost entirely only looks at your current circumstances, but I guess in a lot of European countries, when you have more of a contributory kind of principle, they are actually looking, implicitly, they're looking back into the past a bit more. Yeah, no, that's a good thing. It would be good to look at.
Okay, thank you. Yep.
Ask if you looked at the tagging by age for two reasons. One is that thinking about who are the people who are at the bottom income decile that has £6,000 in assets, going to have a steep age.
Sure.
Secondly, short-term unemployment is much more challenging with the younger but older people process. I'm wondering if you've got any work looking at how the tagging by age.
Yeah, it's a good point. So I did look a bit at age. So essentially what you find is basically for the exact reason you describe, UC takes less money away from younger people because it tends to be older people who have assets, who are owner-occupiers, and who are self-employed. Yeah, that you're exactly right. You get that kind of effect. I suppose the reason why I was a bit nervous about showing results kind of too much by age is obviously here, we're only looking at 8 years here, and whether that you might not kind of give like enough of a longer run picture, given that everyone's going to be 30 or 40 once. But yeah, so I suppose the government could do something kind of a more explicit tagging by age, which over these kind of maybe medium length, medium run horizons might have a kind of a progressive tagging effect. Yeah, it's a good thought. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Yeah, no, okay, yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, it's a good thought. Yeah.
Okay, thank you all. Let's give Tom a round of applause. Okay, we're doing well on time, so you won't even have to miss much of your coffee break. I forgot to say at the beginning that I'm Mike Brewer of the University of Essex, and that this session was organised by the ESRC Research Centre on Microsocial Change, which is based at the University of Essex, and which I direct. This last paper is looking at income dynamics in the more recent period. You can kind of see it as a companion to the first paper. It's by a set of authors all at the University of Essex. Sorry for the slightly wonky formatting here. The motivation here is the widespread popular political concern that insecurity is a growing problem. And our question was really, to what extent can we see insecurity, and particularly income insecurity, in large-scale data sets that are representative of the whole UK population? And so we asked, how has the volatility of individual and household income changed since 2010? And like in the first paper, we want to know how much do public transfers, how much does the benefit system and taxes affect that? And we're exploiting, like Tom's paper, the large panel data set of incomes in Understanding Society, the UK Household Longitudinal Study. A lot of the literature on instability, and I realize I've already used the words instability, insecurity, and volatility in the last 3 slides sort of interchangeably, but let me carry on hand-waving for a bit here. But a lot of the literature on instability has been on earnings, just looking at individual level earnings, usually male earnings, and the classic papers from the US looking over time show this rise in earnings instability from the 1970s to the 1990s, whereupon it leveled off. That we know instability is greater for the low-skilled or the lower-paid, and we think that household income instability has also increased. So the measure of instability being used here is broadly year-on-year changes. In the UK, there's been a little bit less, but the research findings on earnings are similar. So we think that earnings became more unstable during the 1980s. There are conflicting findings about what happened in more recent years. So the third bullet says we can find studies which show that earnings instability has been broadly constant during the 90s, 2000s. Some would show it increased, and some would show it rose then fell. Slightly fewer papers have looked at instability in household income. So the difference I'm making here is between an individual's own earnings from the labour market, that's their earnings, and household income is add up all the sources of income coming into the entire household, including taxes, incorporating taxes and including government transfers. Jenkins and Bartels and Bonker find that income instability has hardly changed, and Blundell and Etheridge again find some trends. So we're looking at the post-2010 period. It was a matter of much regret that these two panel surveys we have for the UK, one finished in 2008 and one started a year or two later, and so we don't have great consistent data that goes through the Great Recession. And because measures of income instability are very dependent on the survey instrument and the way you collect income, we decided in this paper not to try and chain the two together. So our income series starts with Understanding Society, which means the first observation is in 2009, and so our first measurement of volatility comes from 2010. What's happened since then? Well, we've had the 4 years of recession and then broadly 4 years of recovery. What was particularly special about the UK experience is that the fall in output didn't really affect employment or unemployment, instead it affected wages. And that's both true during the initial downfall, but also during the recovery. So big swings in employment, but really not a lot. Initially a small fall in employment and a big fall in wages, and after that a large rise in employment, but not really much happening in wages. That's the economic context. The policy context, we've basically seen cuts to working age benefits and restrictions in the access to out-of-work benefits as all part of the government's austerity period since 2011. But this has been focused on the working age, and those above the state pension age have been largely spared the impacts of austerity. Okay, so I said I've already used these words, instability, volatility, insecurity, interchangeably. Sylvia's paper at the beginning showed you an example of the first sort of paper, a sort of model-based decomposition of income fluctuations into a permanent component and a transitory component. What we're going to do in the second paper is adopt a more data-driven, non-parametric, simpler descriptive measure of income volatility. Our measure is going to be the standard deviation of the ARC percentage change. So the ARC percentage change is like the percentage change in income. So it's the expression underneath the square root sign. So it's like the percentage change, except we divide by the average of the two periods' incomes. So it's change in income is divided by the mean of the income. And if your income was 0 in both periods, we give you we assume that change was 0. So we just divide by dividing by the mean of the two incomes, we reduce the number of times we have to divide by 0, which is helpful. It also means the measure that we come up with is bounded between minus 200 and plus 200. So if your income falls from something to nothing, that gives you a value of minus 200, and if it goes up from nothing to something, you get plus 200. And changes of smaller magnitudes give you smaller changes. It's important that we use a measure which allows for zeros, because there are people in the data who report to have 0 household income, and we don't want to drop those. So we're not focusing on continuously employed men. We want to look at all households. So it's a simple, it's data driven. It's a measure of to what extent incomes change, and then by looking at the standard deviation across the population, we're measuring population-wide volatility in this measure of income change. It doesn't, of course, distinguish between anticipated and unanticipated shocks, or it makes no attempt to distinguish between permanent and transitory shocks, like in the first paper. So for our data, we use the first 7 waves of understanding society, the UK household longitudinal study. We look at adults over 25, because those under 25 have particularly unstable and insecure incomes, largely related to their participation in higher education. So we just look at the over 25s who have valid information on incomes in at least 2 consecutive years, so that we can calculate that measure of volatility for at least once. And this gives us 32,000 of working age individuals and 17,000 individuals over the age of 60. In the very large annex to the paper, which explores in detail the measure of income in understanding society and compares it to the Family Resources Survey, and looks at the role of imputation and also whether attrition might be driving any of our results, and we don't think it is. So like in the first paper, we have several concepts of income. So we start with individuals' own earnings. That's kind of concept one. Concept two is household earnings. So you add up all the earnings, of all the adults in the household and get concept two. Then if you add in other sources of private incomes, so that will be your unearned income sources, maybe you're a landlord or you receive investment income, that gives you number three, your gross private income. Then we add public transfers, so that's means tested and contributory benefits like child benefit, the state pension, and other tax credits and so on. That gives us concept four, and then we take off income tax to give us concept five, household disposable income. Okay, so here are two slides looking at the volatility of private income sources, and here the key finding is these have fallen since 2010. So on the left-hand side we have working age individuals. The line at the top is for individual earnings. So individuals' own earnings has clearly become less volatile over this period. And that there are two lines towards the bottom, sort of on top of each other. One of them is household level earnings, and the other one is all sources of private income coming to the household. So a measure of household level earnings is more stable than a measure of individual level earnings. That's because basically that's telling us that individuals in the households have volatility which in part is offsetting each other. And going from gross labour income to gross market income at the household level makes almost no difference, and that's because unearned income is just not that an important source of income. On the right-hand side, we have those over 60. Now here we see a rise in the volatility of labour income over the period, and this reflects over this period that more people aged over 60 have been in work, and so the more of them that are in work, the more scope there is for their labour income to be volatile. But what's much more important for this group is the fine dashed line at the very top, which falls dramatically from a value of 80 down to a value of 60 something over the period, and that's all of their private sources of income. So pensioner incomes are much less volatile now than they were in 2010. Okay, why is this? So looking at the working age individuals, part of the reason is there is in 2016 less labour market churn than there was in 2010 as we were coming out of recession. So the left-hand panel shows you the fraction of the workforce who leave the labour force each year, or the fraction of the labour force who go into the who move into work in each year, and the fraction who are in continuous employment. So the fraction in continuous employment is the fine dotted line shown on the right-hand axis, which rose over the period from about 0.74 to 0.77. And similarly, the fractions leaving work and the fraction of those not working moving into work fell over this period. On the right-hand side, we then condition our measures of volatility on people who are continuously employed. We still see a fall in volatility of labour market earnings, but it's not as pronounced as it was in the previous slide. So part of the reason that incomes are less volatile is that there are fewer people moving in and out of work. Okay, so because we have these different concepts of income, we basically measure the volatility of these different concepts of income. We can compare them. So looking at the left-hand side for working age individuals, the top line I've showed you before is the volatility of all private income sources coming into the household. If we then add benefits, we get the solid black line, which is the lowest line in the graph, and then we subtract taxes and we get the sort of dashed line slightly above it. So there's a dramatic reduction in volatility when we add in transfers from the state. Well, that's the means tested and non-means tested benefits. And then there is then a small, I got that wrong around the line. That's from the dotted line to the large dashed line, but there's still a large reduction. And then we go from the dashed line to the solid line when we subtract taxes. So the benefit system does a great deal to reduce volatility. The tax system does a small amount to reduce volatility. Looking at the older age, the conclusion is the same, except this time the benefit system does a huge amount to reduce volatility, and this will be because the vast majority, or an awful lot of this group, will be receiving the basic state pension. So for them, income from benefits is very important, and that just helps to flatten out any fluctuation in their other sources of earnings. Now what we find is that looking in detail at how the tax and benefit system helps insulate people and helps reduce volatility is that it's particularly effective at reducing large negative income shocks. So the slide here is looking at the group of the population who left the labour market in any given year, and we're showing the different quantiles of their changes in income. And so on the left-hand side, you'll see that the sort of 10th percentile of income changes is minus 200, which basically means if you move out of work, that quite a large fraction of this group lose all of their earned income. That will be all single adults, for example, who move out of work. They go from having some earnings to nothing. So for them, our measure of change is minus 200. If we then add in benefits and subtract taxes, you get the measures of volatility shown on the right-hand side. And so this has made a huge difference to that measure of income change, particularly at the bottom. So no longer are we seeing the values of minus 200. It doesn't do much. It does rather less for the people who see smaller falls in earnings when they move out of work. And then the other big change, another big transition that can lead to people having large changes in income is a change to their household composition. So this would be splitting up from your partner or gaining a partner or having more or fewer children. And again, the left-hand side shows that various distributions of this change in income over time. And the right-hand graph shows the same changes once we allow for the benefit system and the tax system. And again, you can see that the difference between the two graphs is particularly at the bottom end. So it looks like the tax and benefit system is particularly good at insuring people against these very large falls in income due to changes in household composition. Okay, then the second thing we do is decompose, we take advantage of the fact that we've got this measure of income. We split up all income into these 5 different sources, and we can then do a decomposition of changes in disposable income into we can decompose the variance of disposable income into the variance of the 5 different income sources, terms involving the covariance, and terms involving the share of each income source. Now, in the paper, we show you all the numbers, but on this graph, I'm just going to show you the covariances of some of the key income components. So this is showing you the extent to which different sources of income are moving with each other, or are correlated or not correlated. The 2 lines towards the top are showing you the covariance of taxes with your sources of earnings. And here we are showing a reduced correlation or covariance over the period. So you would expect as your earnings go up, so do your tax payments go up. And what we are showing here is that is less true in 2016 than it was in 2010. So the tax system has become a bit less well correlated with your earnings over time. The solid black line in the middle, which is basically bang on 0, shows the covariance between your own earnings and the earnings of other people in your household. And that's 0. So that's actually, that's according to our data, we're basically finding, I guess, no evidence of, no, that's not true, not no evidence, but we're finding that different members in the household have changes in earnings which are effectively not acting together. There's no correlation at all between them. So people are, according to this data, able to insure each other when they live together. Right? My shock in earnings does not seem to be related to my spouse's shock in earnings. And the 2 lines at the bottom show the covariance, the correlation between your income from the benefit system and other sources of income. So these are negatively correlated. The less earnings I have, the more income from benefits I'm going to get. But the size of that correlation has fallen over time. So they are less well correlated by the end of the period than they were at the start of the period. And this lies behind our conclusion that over these 6 years, the benefit system has become less good at insuring you against changes to your earnings and other sources of income. And that's compounded by the fact, which we don't show you here, that the share of income that comes from benefits has also fallen over this period. So because of austerity, less household income is coming from the benefit system, and it's less well correlated with your changes in your earnings. Okay, then we have a series of robustness checks looking to what extent that our results are driven by imputation to incomes or to attrition. And the answer is they're really not very driven by either of those things. So this is looking at the difference between the full sample on the left and a balanced sample on the right. Sorry, ignore the line at the bottom, that's a typo. So that's looking at attrition. Does attrition affect our results? It doesn't. This slide is looking at to what extent imputation affects our results. So where people don't provide answers to the questions on income, my colleagues at the University of Essex do some imputation to provide you with a measure of income. And we look here at to what extent does income imputation drive our results. Imputation is not really a binary 0-1 phenomenon. You can have different fractions of your income be imputed. So maybe we know, in detail about your earnings, but we don't know about your unearned income, or vice versa. And what we do in this graph, it's quite complicated, is restrict the sample to people who have less and less imputed income. So our normal sample includes people with some imputed income, and then we can restrict that to people who have less and less imputed income. And it makes no difference to our results until we go to the sample who have no imputed income whatsoever. Now, these are a very unusual set of people. They're extremely good at answering survey questions, and they do also seem to have slightly different labour market behaviour. So for them, our conclusions are rather different. You see a very different trend for that dashed dotted line at the bottom from the others. But we think that's because these are, as I say, a rather strange group of people. In summary, then, I've shown you that the volatility of earnings has declined since 2010. And overall, that's led to this fall in the volatility of all sources of private income. It's partly due to a fall in labour market turnover, and it's consistent with strong employment growth that we've seen since 2012. I've shown you that taxes a little bit and benefits an awful lot significantly reduce income volatility, but their ability to do this has fallen over the period we look at, partly because the benefit system has been cut back, but also because it's now less well correlated with changes in earnings. And I quickly whiz through at the end, showing you that our results are fairly robust to attrition and to income imputation. Thank you very much. Yes?
I was wondering if you disaggregated by sex and whether the volatility of female earners was any different to earnings of male earners?
That's a good question. I can't remember the answer. Does Silvia know the answer? Do you want to use?
Did that actually in the beginning, and we found that the levels were different. So women have higher volatility, but the trends were the same. Falling, yeah.
And the reason the women have high volatility is driven by the fact that we are allowing for zeros. So we're looking at. We're not doing a study of volatility amongst continuously employed men and continuously employed women. It's all men and all women. And so women are more likely to go from having zero earnings to some earnings or vice versa. And that's what gives them the high level of volatility. But as Silvia said, the trend is the same. Any others? Yep, Tom?
I feel like this is definitely a naive question, but your results suggested that basically taxes don't do that much, but what you presented that taxes do a lot. But I know you're measuring slightly different things, but what is the?
Yeah, we don't know yet. I mean, they're different things.
Okay.
Sylvia, do you have any ideas?
Well, I'll try. So, I mean. There's different measures, right? And if you look at the literature, this measure of volatility is most closely resembling transitory shocks, right? Because these are year-to-year things, so it's not really long-run effect. So if you look in the paper that I presented, you see that the effect is actually much smaller. But of course, we seem to find some effect, especially during the 1990s, not so much after 2000. But it's an interesting.
It's a different time period as well. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah. No, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll then close it there. So thank you for listening, and thank you to our speakers.